The ATM of the family, that's what the little card said in elegant gold lettering when I picked it up at my son's wedding dinner. For a moment, I honestly thought it was meant for someone else. I turned the card over slowly, the way you do when your mind refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing. But there was no mistake. My name wasn't there. Just that title. The ATM of the family. I looked up from the table and that's when I noticed something strange. The room had gone quiet. Not the lively, cheerful kind of quiet that happens between speeches at a wedding. This was different. Forks stopped moving. Conversations faded into thin air. A few people suddenly found their wine glasses very interesting. Others avoided my eyes entirely. And right across the table, my daughter-in-law Olivia was watching me with a smile that was just a little too tight. I held the card between my fingers and let out a soft laugh. Well, I said calmly, at least they spelled ATM correctly. A few nervous chuckles floated around the table, thin and uncertain. Someone coughed. My son Daniel shifted in his chair beside Olivia, but he didn't say anything. Not a word. I set the card down next to my plate as if it were nothing more than a misplaced seating label. If anyone expected a dramatic scene from a 68-year-old woman at her own son's wedding dinner, they were going to be disappointed. I've lived long enough to know that the quiet moments are the ones that matter most. The room slowly started breathing again. Glasses clinked. Someone resumed a story at the far end of the table. A violinist in the corner kept playing a soft version of Can't Help Falling in Love, and the warm lights from the chandeliers reflected off the polished silverware. It was a beautiful venue, the kind of place Daniel and Olivia had insisted on when they planned the wedding. The ballroom overlooked a stretch of lake that glowed pink and orange in the evening sunset. Outside, small boats drifted lazily across the water. Inside, every table was decorated with white roses and tall candles in crystal holders. It was elegant. Expensive. Perfect for photos. I had helped pay for most of it, of course, but that wasn't something I mentioned out loud. I never had. I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip, letting the coolness settle my thoughts. The card still rested beside my plate, the gold lettering catching the light every time someone moved. The ATM of the family. An interesting title. It certainly wasn't creative. But it was accurate enough, I suppose. 25 years ago, when Daniel was in college and called me one evening sounding worried about tuition, I wrote the first check without thinking twice. Later came the down payment for his first house. Then the loan that quietly turned into a gift when his small marketing business struggled during its first year. And just last winter, when he and Olivia started talking about having a wedding that everyone would remember, I transferred another generous amount into Daniel's account so they could book this very ballroom overlooking the lake. I never kept a running total. Mothers rarely do. You help when your child needs it. That's just how life works. Across the table, Olivia lifted her champagne flute and leaned toward one of her bridesmaids, whispering something that made the young woman cover her mouth to hide a laugh. Daniel finally glanced at the card beside my plate, and for a fraction of a second his face tightened. Then he quickly looked away, straightening his tie as if the knot had suddenly become fascinating. The servers moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses, and placing plates of roasted chicken and vegetables in front of the guests. The smell of rosemary and butter filled the air. Someone at another table began clapping, and soon Daniel stood up, lifting his glass to begin a toast. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, his voice warm and confident as it carried across the room. "Olivia and I are so grateful to celebrate this moment with the people who have supported us every step of the way." Applause followed, polite and cheerful. Daniel smiled broadly, looking around the room at friends, relatives, co-workers, and neighbors who had gathered to celebrate his marriage. "Family support," he continued, raising his glass slightly higher, "means everything to us. Especially the kind that keeps showing up whenever we need it." His eyes flickered toward my end of the table for the briefest moment. It was quick. Most people probably didn't notice. But I did. I have spent nearly 7 decades reading people's expressions. It becomes second nature after a while. The guests laughed softly at the line, assuming it was just another light-hearted wedding remark. Olivia leaned against Daniel's shoulder, smiling brightly as cameras flashed around the room. I clapped along with everyone else. The toast ended, glasses lifted, and the band transitioned into a gentle instrumental tune while guests resumed their conversations. Someone at the neighboring table began telling a story about Daniel as a teenager, and the laughter grew louder again. Life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But every so often, someone's eyes drifted toward the small card beside my plate. They didn't stare long. Just a quick glance. Then they'd look away. Curious. Uncomfortable. Unsure. I traced the rim of my glass with my finger and studied the room quietly. Weddings are interesting places. People believe they are watching the beginning of something beautiful. And often they are. But sometimes, without realizing it, they are also watching the moment when the truth finally decides to introduce itself. The candles flickered softly. The lake outside had darkened into deep blue as night settled in. Somewhere behind me, a photographer's camera shutter clicked again and again, capturing smiling faces and raised glasses. I picked up the card one more time, studying the neat gold letters. The ATM of the family. I turned it over between my fingers, then placed it back on the table exactly where it had been. And for the first time that evening, a small thought crossed my mind, quiet and clear as the lake outside the ballroom windows. If that was truly the role they believed I played in their lives, then perhaps it was time for the machine to stop working. The music continued drifting softly through the ballroom after Daniel finished his toast, the gentle sound of a piano blending with the quiet clinking of glasses and silverware. Conversations returned slowly, like waves rolling back onto the shore after pulling away for a moment. I noticed how people spoke a little more carefully now, their voices lower, their laughter shorter. The small white card still rested beside my plate, its gold letters reflecting the warm candlelight each time someone moved nearby. The ATM of the family. It was a strange thing how 4 simple words could make a room feel different. I picked up my fork and began eating the roasted chicken that had been placed in front of me earlier. It was tender and perfectly seasoned, the kind of meal that probably cost more per plate than what Daniel and I used to spend on groceries for an entire week when he was a child. Across the table, Olivia was chatting with her bridesmaids again, her voice light and cheerful as if nothing unusual had happened. She laughed easily, tossing her long brown hair over her shoulder while describing the honeymoon trip they planned to take the following week. Apparently they had booked a villa somewhere along the coast of Italy, a place with a private terrace overlooking the sea. I had heard about it already, of course. Daniel had called me 3 months ago asking if I could help them finalize the reservation because the deposit was larger than they expected. I had transferred the money that same afternoon without hesitation. That was what mothers did. At least, that was what I believed for most of my life. Daniel finally sat down again after greeting a few relatives who had stopped by to congratulate him. For a moment he avoided looking at the card beside my plate, but eventually his eyes drifted toward it. I saw the slight tightening around his mouth before he forced a casual smile. "Everything good, Mom?" he asked quietly. His voice was polite, almost careful. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and met his eyes. "The dinner is lovely," I replied calmly. "You and Olivia chose a beautiful place." He nodded quickly, relieved perhaps that I had not said anything more. Olivia leaned forward slightly, glancing toward the card and then back at me. "It was supposed to be a joke," she said lightly, as though explaining something harmless. "You know how families tease each other." A few people at the table chuckled softly, though the laughter faded quickly when no one else joined in. I studied her expression for a moment. Her smile remained perfectly in place, bright and confident. She looked like someone who expected the entire room to agree with her version of reality. I had seen that kind of confidence before. It usually appeared in people who had never been told no. "Well," I said gently, lifting my glass of water again, "families certainly do have their own sense of humor." That seemed to satisfy her. Olivia leaned back in her chair and resumed her conversation about the honeymoon, describing the blue water and the small cafes she wanted to visit along the coast. Daniel listened with a proud smile, nodding occasionally as she spoke. Watching them together, I could not help remembering a very different version of my son. Daniel had once been the little boy who insisted on helping me carry groceries into the house even when the bags were too heavy for his small arms. When he was 10 years old, he had built a crooked birdhouse in the backyard and proudly hung it from the maple tree outside my kitchen window. For years he asked my advice about everything, from which college he should attend to whether he should accept his first job offer in the city. Somewhere along the way those conversations had slowly changed. They became shorter. Less frequent. Eventually they turned into quick phone calls about financial problems that needed immediate solutions. The band began playing a slower melody as couples moved toward the dance floor. The room filled with the soft rustle of dresses and the low hum of conversation while the photographer directed guests into different group pictures. Olivia stood and smoothed her dress before pulling Daniel toward the center of the floor. Applause followed as they began their first dance, moving slowly beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Everyone watched them with smiles and raised phones, capturing the moment from every angle. I remained seated at the table, the small card still beside my plate like an unexpected guest that refused to leave. After a few minutes, someone slid into the empty chair beside me. I turned and saw my niece Emily, who had arrived earlier in the evening but had been seated with some of the younger cousins near the other side of the ballroom. Emily leaned closer and lowered her voice slightly. "Grandma Margaret," she whispered gently, "are you all right?" I smiled at her. Emily had always been perceptive, even as a child. "I am perfectly fine," I told her. She glanced down at the card on the table and her eyebrows drew together slightly. "I heard Olivia talking about those place cards yesterday when we were helping set up decorations," Emily said quietly. She thought people would find it funny. I looked out toward the dance floor where Daniel and Olivia were still turning slowly beneath the lights. Around them guests clapped softly and swayed to the music. "Did she?" I asked calmly. Emily nodded. "She said you were the reason they could afford everything tonight." There was no cruelty in Emily's voice when she repeated those words. Only concern. I reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "Well," I said thoughtfully, "that part is not entirely incorrect." Emily studied my face for a moment, as if trying to understand something deeper than what I had said. "Does it bother you?" she asked. I glanced down once more at the small white card, the gold letters shining quietly beneath the candlelight. Then I looked back toward the dance floor where my son laughed as Olivia spun gracefully in his arms. For a long moment I did not answer. Finally I spoke in the same calm voice I had used all evening. "No," I said softly. "But it does clarify a few things." Emily followed my gaze across the room. "What do you mean?" she asked. I folded my hands neatly on the table and leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the music drift through the room while the celebration continued around us. "It simply means," I explained slowly, "that when people show you exactly how they see you, it is usually wise to believe them." The music from the band drifted gently across the ballroom while Daniel and Olivia continued their first dance, their movements slow and practiced beneath the warm lights that hung from the high ceiling. Around them, guests stood in small groups, smiling and raising their phones to capture photographs that would later appear on social media with captions about love and family and beautiful beginnings. I remained seated at the table, my hands folded lightly in front of me while the small white card rested beside my plate like a quiet reminder that the evening had revealed more than anyone intended. Emily sat beside me for a moment longer, watching the dance floor thoughtfully before she excused herself to join some of the cousins near the dessert table. When she stood up she squeezed my shoulder gently, the way a thoughtful young person does when they sense something deeper is happening but do not yet understand it fully. I watched her walk away and then allowed my eyes to move slowly across the ballroom. Weddings are curious events because they place everyone in the same room yet reveal very different versions of reality depending on where you are sitting. At one table people laughed loudly while sharing stories about college days and old vacations. At another table distant relatives spoke politely about the weather and the drive into town. Near the bar a group of Daniel's co-workers clinked glasses while discussing business deals and future promotions. Everyone seemed perfectly comfortable inside the celebration they believed they were attending. Meanwhile, the card beside my plate continued to reflect the candlelight, its gold letters shining quietly each time the flames flickered. The ATM of the family. I picked it up again, turning it slowly between my fingers as I listened to the applause that followed the end of the dance. Daniel kissed Olivia's cheek and the room filled with cheerful clapping before the band shifted into a livelier tune that invited more guests onto the dance floor. Several couples joined them, laughing and swaying to the rhythm while waiters began clearing the dinner plates from the tables. One of the young servers approached me with a polite smile and asked if I would like coffee or tea. I requested coffee and thanked him. A few minutes later he returned with a small white cup resting on a saucer, steam rising gently from the dark surface of the drink. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain and took a slow sip, letting the quiet bitterness settle across my tongue. For some reason the taste reminded me of the small kitchen Daniel and I shared 28 years ago when he was finishing his last year of high school. At that time I worked 2 jobs, one at a local insurance office during the day and another part-time bookkeeping position in the evenings. Every morning I would drink a cup of coffee exactly like this one while reviewing the household bills spread across the kitchen table. Daniel often sat nearby eating cereal while talking excitedly about his plans for the future. He wanted to study marketing at the state university, he told me. He dreamed about starting his own company someday and building something successful from the ground up. I believed in that dream so completely that I spent years making sure he would never have to give it up because of money. I helped with tuition payments. I helped with rent during his first internship. When his small marketing firm struggled during its first year, I quietly covered the operating expenses until the business finally began to stabilize. None of those decisions ever felt like sacrifices to me at the time. They felt like investments in the person my son was becoming. I placed the coffee cup back onto the saucer and glanced once more toward the dance floor. Daniel was laughing now as one of his college friends attempted an enthusiastic but slightly awkward dance move that caused the surrounding guests to clap and cheer. Olivia stood nearby speaking with her bridesmaids again, her voice confident and animated as she described the next part of the evening schedule. The wedding planner moved through the room checking her clipboard while adjusting decorations and speaking quietly to the band between songs. Everything looked smooth and effortless, exactly the kind of celebration Olivia had imagined when she first began planning the event nearly a year ago. I remember the afternoon she visited my house with a binder full of ideas and color samples, explaining that she wanted the wedding to feel elegant but also unforgettable. The venue by the lake would be perfect, she said. The flowers should be white roses because they photographed beautifully. The reception dinner should include a live band because recorded music would feel less personal. Each suggestion carried another expense attached to it, but I listened patiently and nodded because Daniel looked so proud sitting beside her on my living room couch. When the planning meeting ended, he walked me to the door and quietly asked if I could help them cover some of the larger costs. I told him of course I would. Mothers rarely calculate the exact moment when generosity slowly becomes expectation. The band finished another song and the guests applauded again before the lead singer announced that dessert would soon be served. Several waiters rolled a long table covered with cakes and pastries toward the center of the room. The smell of chocolate and vanilla drifted through the ballroom while people gathered around to admire the display. I noticed that Olivia's bridesmaids were taking photographs of the cake from several angles while the photographer positioned Daniel and Olivia beside it for another set of pictures. My attention returned briefly to the card resting on the table. I studied the gold letters again, noticing how carefully they had been printed in graceful script. Someone had taken time to design this detail. It was not an accident. It was a message. I set the card down beside my coffee cup and leaned back in my chair while the celebration continued around me. For most of the evening I had listened quietly, observing the conversations and the subtle expressions that passed between people whenever their eyes drifted toward my table. No one had confronted the moment directly, yet the room had absorbed it like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were small but they continued moving outward with every passing minute. After a while Daniel approached my table again, this time holding 2 small plates with slices of cake. He placed one gently in front of me and smiled in the careful way someone does when they are uncertain about the emotional weather in a room. "Chocolate or vanilla?" he asked. Chocolate, I replied softly. He nodded and sat down for a moment, glancing once again at the card before quickly focusing his attention on the cake instead. We both remained quiet while the music continued and the guests laughed around us. Finally Daniel cleared his throat and spoke in a low voice. Mom, I hope you know we appreciate everything you have done for us. I met his eyes calmly and offered a small smile. I am glad the wedding turned out the way you wanted, I said. He seemed relieved by my response and nodded again before standing to return to the dance floor where Olivia waited for him. I watched him walk away and felt a strange sense of clarity settle quietly into my thoughts. The celebration would continue for several more hours. The guests would dance and laugh and take photographs that captured the beginning of Daniel and Olivia's married life. Tomorrow the decorations would be taken down and the ballroom would return to its usual quiet view of the lake. But the message written on that small white card had already done something far more permanent than anyone realized. It had answered a question I did not even know I had been asking myself for years. The ballroom had grown warmer as the evening continued, filled with the soft glow of candles and the comfortable hum of conversation that follows a successful wedding dinner. Guests moved easily between the dance floor and the dessert table while the band played another slow melody that echoed gently against the tall windows overlooking the dark lake outside. I remained seated at the table for a few more minutes after Daniel returned to the celebration, finishing the last bite of chocolate cake while the small white card rested quietly beside my coffee cup. The gold letters seemed almost elegant now in the candlelight, as if the phrase had been designed to blend naturally into the evening. The ATM of the family. I turned the card once more between my fingers before slipping it calmly into my purse. The action was simple and unnoticed, yet it felt strangely important, like preserving a receipt for a purchase that had already been completed. Across the room Olivia was laughing again with two of her friends while Daniel spoke with a group of co-workers near the bar. Their voices rose above the music occasionally, cheerful and confident in the way people sound when they believe everything in their world is exactly as it should be. I watched them for a moment and then slowly stood from my chair. The ballroom stretched wide before me, decorated with white roses and soft golden lights that reflected across polished floors and glass windows. From a distance the entire evening looked perfect. That was the interesting thing about celebrations. They often hide the quiet turning points that shape everything afterward. I walked slowly toward the large windows at the edge of the room where the view opened toward the lake. Outside the night had settled fully now, the water dark and smooth except for the scattered reflections of lights from small boats drifting along the shoreline. A light breeze moved the branches of nearby trees, and the distant sound of laughter from the ballroom followed me faintly through the glass. Standing there, away from the music and conversations, I felt a familiar memory rise gently in my thoughts. It was the memory of Richard, my late husband, standing beside me in our kitchen many years ago while we discussed what would happen to the things we had built together over the course of our lives. Richard had always been a careful planner. He believed that money was not simply something to spend but something that should protect the people you loved long after you were gone. One evening, about 5 years before he passed away, he spread several documents across our kitchen table and explained that he wanted to establish a family trust. The trust would hold our savings, the small commercial property we owned downtown, and the investment accounts that had grown steadily over the years. Daniel would benefit from it eventually, Richard explained, but the structure of the trust would allow me to manage everything first. That way, if life ever became complicated or uncertain, I would still have full control over the assets we had built together. At the time I listened patiently while Richard explained the legal details, though I remember teasing him lightly about sounding like a cautious banker instead of the optimistic man I had married decades earlier. Richard only smiled and said something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. He said that the most important part of any plan was not how it began but who ultimately decided how it was used. I had not thought about that conversation in quite some time. But standing near the quiet window of my son's wedding reception, with the sound of laughter drifting through the ballroom behind me, the memory felt unusually clear. I reached into my purse again and touched the small card resting inside. Its presence there felt almost symbolic now, like a small piece of evidence preserved from a moment that had quietly changed the direction of something larger. Behind me the music shifted to a brighter tempo as several guests began clapping along with the band. Someone announced that the bouquet toss would happen soon, and a group of Olivia's friends hurried toward the center of the room with excited voices. The photographer moved quickly through the crowd preparing for another round of pictures while waiters refreshed glasses and cleared empty plates from the tables. The celebration had entered its liveliest stage now, the point in the evening when laughter becomes louder and people begin sharing stories that will be repeated for years afterward. I turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the main floor of the ballroom. As I passed one of the tables, I noticed Emily again speaking with several cousins, her expression thoughtful as she glanced briefly in my direction. When our eyes met, she offered a small, reassuring smile. I returned the smile and continued walking until I reached my seat once more. The chair felt comfortable and familiar, as if it had been waiting for me to return and observe the rest of the evening with the same quiet patience I had carried throughout most of my life. A few minutes later, Daniel approached again, this time holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. He handed one to me and sat beside me for a moment, watching the crowd gather near the dance floor. "It has been a great night," he said, sounding relieved and proud at the same time. I nodded gently. "Yes," I replied, taking a small sip from the glass. "It certainly has been memorable." Daniel looked toward Olivia, who stood laughing with her friends in the center of the room. The light from the chandeliers reflected off her white dress while the photographer adjusted his camera to capture the next moment of celebration. "We could not have done any of this without you," Daniel added after a pause. His voice carried a hint of sincerity, though it also sounded like something he had repeated several times that evening. I studied his expression carefully before responding. "I am glad everything worked out," I said calmly. Daniel seemed satisfied with that answer. He stood after another moment and returned to Olivia's side as the music grew louder again. I remained seated, holding the glass lightly in my hands while the celebration continued around me. Somewhere behind the music and laughter another thought had begun to form quietly, the same clear thought that first appeared when I read the words printed on that small card earlier in the evening. It was a simple realization, but sometimes the simplest realizations arrive with the greatest clarity. For many years I had helped build the life my son now enjoyed, believing that generosity would naturally create gratitude. Tonight had shown me something different. It had shown me exactly how that generosity had been understood. And once a truth reveals itself so clearly, it becomes very difficult to ignore. The celebration continued well into the evening, growing louder and more energetic with every passing hour. Guests gathered in larger circles near the dance floor while the band shifted into brighter music that encouraged laughter and applause. Olivia's friends surrounded her with cheerful excitement as they prepared for the bouquet toss, their voices rising above the music while the photographer adjusted his position to capture every smiling face in the room. Daniel stood beside her looking relaxed and proud, greeting relatives and shaking hands with co-workers who congratulated him on both the wedding and the beautiful reception. From a distance the entire scene looked effortless, the kind of evening people would later describe as perfect when they remembered it months or years later. I remained seated quietly, observing the movement of the room the same way someone watches waves roll across a lake. Every moment seemed natural and celebratory, yet the clarity that had settled in my mind earlier had not faded. Instead it had become steadier, like a calm thought that refuses to leave once it has finally been understood. I lifted my glass again and took a small sip while the band finished another song and the guests applauded enthusiastically. A waiter approached to collect empty plates and replace them with fresh napkins as the dessert table continued drawing small groups of guests who admired the cakes and pastries arranged beneath soft white lights. The smell of vanilla and chocolate lingered in the air while the photographer directed Olivia and her friends toward the center of the dance floor for the bouquet toss. I watched as Olivia laughed and raised the flowers high above her head before turning playfully toward the crowd of women waiting behind her. The room filled with cheers and playful excitement while the music paused briefly for the moment. When she tossed the bouquet, several guests jumped forward at once and the flowers landed in the hands of one of her bridesmaids who immediately covered her mouth with surprise as the room erupted with applause. The music resumed again and the celebration moved forward exactly as planned. Yet for me the evening had already passed its most important moment. I sat quietly for a few minutes longer, listening to the music and the laughter around me while the small card rested safely inside my purse. The phrase written on it had been simple, almost careless in its design, but its meaning had revealed something that years of polite conversations and family gatherings had never quite shown so clearly before. Eventually I stood and walked slowly toward the hallway that led outside the ballroom. The air in the corridor felt cooler and calmer than the warmth of the celebration behind me. A few framed photographs of the venue hung along the walls, showing the lake during different seasons of the year. In one photograph the water reflected bright autumn leaves from the surrounding trees. In another the shoreline was covered with snow beneath a pale winter sky. I paused for a moment to study those quiet images before continuing down the hall toward the small balcony that overlooked the water. Outside the night air felt fresh against my face. The lake stretched quietly into the darkness, its surface reflecting the distant lights from boats and lakeside houses scattered along the shore. For a moment I simply stood there breathing slowly, letting the quiet settle around me. Weddings always remind people of beginnings, but sometimes they also reveal the quiet endings of certain illusions. I reached into my purse again and took out the card, holding it gently between my fingers while the night breeze moved softly across the balcony. The gold lettering still shone faintly beneath the outdoor lights. The ATM of the family. I studied the words carefully, not with anger but with a kind of calm curiosity. For many years I had believed that my role within the family was something understood naturally, something based on love, respect, and gratitude built gradually through shared experiences. But the message on that card suggested something different. It suggested that my contributions had become ordinary to them, predictable even. Not an act of generosity, but a function. A service. Something that could be joked about openly during a wedding dinner because it had been accepted for so long. I slipped the card back into my purse and looked once more across the quiet lake before returning inside. When I re-entered the ballroom the music had grown lively again and several couples were dancing enthusiastically near the center of the floor. Daniel spotted me near the entrance and walked over with an easy smile. "There you are," he said. "I was wondering where you went." His tone was friendly and relaxed, the way people sound when they assume everything is exactly as it should be. I returned the smile gently. "I stepped outside for a little fresh air," I replied. "The evening is beautiful by the lake." Daniel nodded and glanced toward the dance floor where Olivia was speaking animatedly with her friends again. "We are glad you could be here tonight," he said after a moment. "It means a lot." I studied his expression quietly before answering. "Of course," I said softly. "It is an important day for you." Daniel seemed satisfied with that answer. He placed a hand lightly on my shoulder and then excused himself to join Olivia as the band began another song. I watched him cross the room and disappear into the movement of guests and music. Around me the celebration continued exactly as planned. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through the ballroom. The photographer captured more smiling faces as the evening slowly moved toward its final hours. But inside my thoughts something had shifted permanently. Richard's careful planning years ago returned clearly to my mind again, along with the quiet conversation we once shared at our kitchen table about protecting what we had built together. At the time I had listened with patience and affection, never imagining how relevant those preparations might become someday. Tonight, however, the meaning of those documents felt clearer than it ever had before. I remained at the edge of the dance floor for a few minutes longer before returning to my seat. The celebration was still full of warmth and music, yet beneath that joyful atmosphere another realization had begun to settle firmly into place. If my role in their lives had truly been reduced to a machine that provided money whenever it was needed, then perhaps it was finally time to decide when that machine would stop operating. The music carried on long after that thought settled into my mind, bright and cheerful as the celebration moved toward the later hours of the evening. Guests had grown more relaxed now, their laughter louder and their movements looser as the band played a series of familiar songs that encouraged people onto the dance floor. From my seat near the edge of the ballroom I watched the room with quiet attention, noticing the small details that most people overlook when they are caught up in celebration. Daniel stood near the center of the floor speaking with several co-workers, his arm occasionally resting around Olivia's shoulders as they laughed together. Olivia seemed completely at ease, greeting guests, posing for photographs, and moving through the room with the confidence of someone who believed the entire evening had unfolded exactly as she intended. Every so often a relative would approach my table to exchange a few polite words about the wedding or the beautiful location. I responded with the same calm smile I had worn throughout the evening. No one mentioned the small moment that had occurred earlier during dinner, yet the memory of it lingered quietly beneath the surface of every conversation. I could see it in the brief pauses when someone's eyes drifted toward my purse resting beside my chair. Inside that purse the small white card remained exactly where I had placed it, preserved like a quiet document of the truth that had revealed itself. After a while Emily returned and sat beside me again, her expression thoughtful as she watched the dance floor. She leaned slightly closer and spoke in a gentle voice that barely rose above the music. "Grandma Margaret, are you sure you are all right tonight?" I turned toward her and smiled. "I am perfectly all right," I answered softly. Emily studied my face for a moment as if searching for something deeper behind my words. "I heard a few people talking earlier," she said carefully. "Some of them thought the place card joke might have gone too far." I considered that for a moment before responding. "Sometimes people learn the most about themselves through jokes," I replied quietly. Emily frowned slightly, unsure how to interpret that answer. I reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "Do not worry," I added. "Tonight has simply been very informative." Emily nodded slowly but did not press further. After a moment she stood and returned to join the other cousins near the dessert table, leaving me once again to observe the room in peaceful silence. The band began another song and several guests cheered as Daniel and Olivia stepped forward for another dance. Their movements were confident and easy, their smiles bright beneath the warm lights of the chandeliers. Watching them, I could not help remembering a much earlier evening nearly 3 decades ago when Daniel was only 12 years old. It had been the night of his school talent show, and he had stood nervously behind the curtain clutching a small guitar he had practiced with for weeks. Before he walked onto the stage he turned to me and whispered that he was afraid he might forget the chords. I had placed my hand on his shoulder and told him that no matter what happened I would always be proud of him for trying. He had stepped onto that stage with determination and played the entire song, without missing a note. When the audience applauded, his face lit up with a smile that carried the simple joy of a child discovering confidence for the first time. I remembered that moment clearly now while watching the man he had become dancing across the polished floor of the ballroom. Life has a quiet way of changing people one small step at a time. Sometimes those steps move so gradually that we hardly notice the direction they are taking until one day the difference becomes impossible to ignore. The music slowed again and the dancers swayed gently as couples held each other beneath the warm glow of the lights. Around the room the conversation softened into quieter tones while the photographer captured another series of images that would later fill photo albums and social media pages. From the outside it still looked like a perfect wedding celebration, the kind of evening families proudly remember for years afterward. Yet for me the evening had become something else entirely. It had become the moment when a long unanswered question finally received its answer. After a while Daniel approached my table once more. He seemed slightly more serious now, perhaps sensing that the night was beginning to wind down. "Mom," he said, pulling a chair beside mine. "We are thinking about taking a longer honeymoon than we originally planned. Olivia found a beautiful place in Italy that rents small villas by the week." His tone carried the careful optimism of someone introducing an idea that might require support. I listened quietly without interrupting. "The only issue is that the extended stay will cost more than we expected," he continued. "But we thought maybe you might be able to help us again, just until the business revenue improves next quarter." He spoke the words naturally, almost casually, as if the request were an ordinary part of the evening. I looked at him calmly, noticing how easily the assumption had been spoken. For a moment I said nothing at all. The music drifted softly through the ballroom while the guests laughed and danced nearby. Finally I gave a small nod. "I see," I said quietly. Daniel seemed relieved that I had not immediately objected. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. "I knew you would understand," he replied. I returned the smile politely, though inside my thoughts had already begun moving in a very different direction. Earlier in the evening a small card had explained exactly how my role in their lives was perceived. Now Daniel's request had confirmed it without hesitation. Machines are expected to operate whenever someone presses the right button. They are not asked how they feel about it. They are simply expected to deliver the result. I reached for my glass and took a slow sip while considering the calm realization that had been forming since dinner. Daniel watched me patiently, waiting for the familiar answer he had received so many times before. At last I spoke again, my voice as steady and gentle as it had been all evening. "Let us talk about that later," I said. Daniel nodded with easy confidence. "Of course," he replied. "We can go over the details tomorrow." He stood and returned to the dance floor, already certain that the solution would arrive exactly as it always had. I remained seated quietly while the music continued and the guests celebrated around me. The evening still appeared joyful and effortless to everyone else in the room. But inside my mind a decision had begun to take shape with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. For many years I had been willing to provide whatever help my family required because I believed that love and generosity were naturally understood. Tonight had shown me something very different. And once a person sees the truth clearly, the next step becomes remarkably simple. The music continued long after Daniel returned to the dance floor, but my thoughts had already moved far beyond the celebration unfolding around me. I remained seated quietly while the band played another familiar song, watching the movement of the room with the calm attention that comes when a person has finally understood something important. Guests laughed and applauded as Olivia spun gracefully beneath the chandelier lights, her white dress catching the glow of the room while the photographer circled the dance floor capturing another round of cheerful images. To anyone else it looked like a joyful evening that would end with hugs, good wishes, and promises to stay in touch. But for me the evening had already delivered its real message hours earlier, printed neatly in gold letters on a small piece of cardstock. The ATM of the family. I reached for my purse and briefly felt the outline of the card resting inside it. Still exactly where I had placed it. Somehow the presence of that small object felt almost grounding, like a quiet reminder that clarity had finally arrived after years of slow misunderstandings. A waiter passed by and offered to refill my glass of sparkling cider, which I accepted with a polite nod. The cold bubbles rose slowly through the glass while the music shifted into another upbeat melody. Daniel and Olivia laughed with friends near the center of the floor, their voices blending with the rhythm of the band and the cheerful applause of guests who had clearly enjoyed the evening. After a moment Emily returned to my side once again, carrying 2 small cups of coffee from the dessert table. She placed one gently in front of me and sat down with the thoughtful seriousness that had always made her seem older than her years. For a moment we both watched the dance floor without speaking. Finally she turned toward me and said quietly, "Grandma Margaret, I heard Daniel asking you something earlier. It sounded important." I smiled gently and lifted the coffee cup. "He mentioned extending the honeymoon," I explained calmly. Emily nodded slowly. "And he expects you to help pay for it," she said, not as a question but as an observation. I took a small sip of coffee before answering. "That does appear to be the expectation." Emily studied my face again, perhaps looking for frustration or disappointment, but she found neither. Instead there was only the same calm expression I had worn all evening. "Does it upset you?" she asked softly. I considered her question for a moment. "No," I said quietly. "What it does is confirm something that had already become very clear." Emily waited patiently, sensing that I might say more. I placed the coffee cup back onto the table and folded my hands together. "Sometimes people believe generosity is permanent," I continued gently. "They assume that because something has always worked one way, it will continue that way forever." Emily looked toward the dance floor where Daniel was now speaking with several friends near the band. "But things can change," she said thoughtfully. I nodded. "Yes. They can." The music softened again as the band began a slower song. Several couples stepped onto the floor, moving together beneath the warm lights while the photographer quietly adjusted his camera once more. Around us the celebration carried on exactly as it had all evening. Yet inside my mind another memory had returned, one that had not crossed my thoughts in quite some time. It was the memory of the day Richard and I had visited Martin Hayes, the attorney who helped establish the family trust years earlier. Martin had been a calm and methodical man who believed in explaining every detail carefully so that nothing would ever be misunderstood later. During that meeting he had looked directly at me and said something that felt almost overly cautious at the time. He said that a trust is not only a legal structure but also a safeguard for the person who controls it. If circumstances ever change, he explained, the trustee always has the authority to make decisions that protect the long-term purpose of those assets. At the time I had nodded politely, assuming that such caution would never truly be necessary. After all, families naturally care for one another. That had always been my belief. Now, sitting quietly at my son's wedding reception while the music echoed through the ballroom, I realized how wise Richard had been to plan ahead. The trust documents were clear. Every account, every investment, every property connected to it remained under my authority for as long as I chose to maintain that responsibility. Daniel would one day benefit from it, but only under conditions that ensured the assets were used wisely. I reached into my purse once more and touched the card again, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers. The words printed on it had been intended as a joke, perhaps even a playful one in Olivia's mind. But the message had carried a deeper truth than anyone at the table realized. When people openly describe you as a machine, they have already forgotten that machines can be turned off. Emily was still watching me quietly. "You seem very calm," she said after a moment. I smiled gently. Calm decisions are usually the most effective ones. She nodded slowly, though I could tell she was still trying to understand exactly what that meant. Across the room Daniel suddenly raised his glass again while speaking to a group of guests, and several people laughed loudly in response. The celebration would continue for another hour or two before the final goodbyes began. Tomorrow Daniel and Olivia would wake up expecting the future to unfold exactly as they had imagined it earlier in the evening. But the future often begins changing long before people realize it. I took another small sip of coffee and watched the room with quiet patience while the band continued playing. Somewhere beneath the music and laughter a decision had fully settled into place. It was not an angry decision, nor was it dramatic. It was simply clear. Tomorrow morning I would make a phone call to Martin Hayes. And that conversation would begin a very different chapter than the one Daniel and Olivia believed was waiting for them. The music finally began to soften as the evening approached its final hour, the lively rhythm of the band gradually shifting into slower melodies that signaled the celebration was beginning to wind down. Guests who had been dancing earlier now gathered in smaller groups near the tables, finishing the last pieces of cake and speaking quietly while the waiters began clearing empty glasses from the room. From where I sat I could see the large windows overlooking the lake, the dark water reflecting the lights of the ballroom like scattered stars across the surface. Daniel stood near the bar with several friends, laughing while they retold stories from their college years. Olivia was speaking with her bridesmaids again, her voice bright and animated as she described the honeymoon plans she had mentioned earlier in the evening. To anyone else the night would be remembered as a beautiful wedding filled with laughter and warm memories. Yet for me the most important part of the evening had already happened long before the final dance began. I remained seated quietly while the band played a gentle instrumental piece, my thoughts steady and clear in a way they had not been for a very long time. Emily returned to my side once again, carrying a small plate with the last slice of cake from the dessert table. She set it down in front of me even though I had already finished mine earlier. "I thought you might want one more," she said softly. I smiled and thanked her, though I did not take a bite right away. Instead I watched the room for a moment longer. The celebration had grown quieter now. People were beginning to gather their coats and say their goodbyes. The photographer was packing his equipment while the wedding planner checked her clipboard and spoke quietly with the staff about the schedule for closing the ballroom. Emily followed my gaze across the room before speaking again. "Are you really going to call Mr. Hayes tomorrow?" she asked gently. I turned toward her and nodded. "Yes," I replied calmly. Emily looked thoughtful for a moment. "Daniel and Olivia think everything will continue the same way it always has," she said carefully. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip before answering. That is often the case when people believe a system will always operate exactly as it did before. Emily smiled faintly at that. "Like a machine," she said. I reached into my purse and placed the small card on the table between us. The gold letters reflected the soft candlelight once again. The ATM of the family. Emily stared at it for a moment, then looked back at me with quiet understanding. Machines do not usually decide when to stop, she said thoughtfully. I returned the card to my purse before replying. No, I said softly. But the person who owns the machine always can. The band began playing the final song of the evening, a slow melody that drew the remaining couples onto the dance floor for one last dance. Daniel and Olivia stepped forward together again, holding each other closely while the guests formed a circle around them. Applause filled the room as the music rose gently toward its final notes. I watched them for a moment, noticing how confident and comfortable they appeared, completely certain that the future ahead of them would unfold exactly as they expected. When the song ended, the room erupted with cheerful clapping once more. Daniel raised his arm around Olivia's shoulders while the photographer captured the last photographs of the evening. Then the lights brightened slightly and the wedding planner announced that the reception had officially concluded. Guests began moving toward the exits, hugging one another and offering their final congratulations before stepping into the cool night air outside the ballroom. Daniel soon spotted me again and walked over with Olivia beside him. Their expressions were warm and relaxed, as if the evening had confirmed everything they hoped it would be. Mom, Daniel said, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder, thank you again for coming tonight. It means a lot to us. Olivia nodded beside him. It really was a perfect evening, she added with a bright smile. Everyone had such a wonderful time. I stood slowly and adjusted my coat while looking at both of them calmly. Yes, I said gently. It was certainly memorable. Daniel seemed pleased with that response. We will call you tomorrow, he continued. Maybe we can talk about the honeymoon plans and the travel details. His tone carried the same quiet confidence it had earlier in the evening, the confidence of someone who had already assumed the answer would be yes. I gave a small nod. We will talk soon, I replied. Olivia leaned forward and gave me a brief polite hug before stepping back beside Daniel. A few minutes later they were surrounded by friends again as everyone prepared to leave the ballroom together. I walked slowly toward the exit, pausing once more near the large windows that overlooked the lake. Outside the water was calm and dark beneath the night sky, reflecting the soft lights from the building behind me. For a moment I stood there quietly, remembering Richard's careful voice at the kitchen table years ago when he explained the purpose of the trust he had created for our family. At the time his planning had seemed almost unnecessary. Tonight it felt remarkably wise. I stepped outside into the cool night air and walked toward the parking area where the remaining guests were saying their final goodbyes. The laughter and music from the ballroom faded behind me as the doors closed. Somewhere inside my purse the small white card remained safe and undamaged, a quiet reminder of the moment that had clarified everything. Tomorrow morning the celebration would already feel like a distant memory to most of the people who attended. But for me tomorrow would mark the beginning of something entirely different. Tomorrow I would make a phone call to Martin Hayes. And after that call, the machine they had joked about earlier in the evening would begin shutting down in ways none of them had yet imagined. The night after the wedding ended quietly, the kind of quiet that feels almost unfamiliar after hours of music, laughter, and crowded conversation. By the time I reached my house the streets were nearly empty, and the lake behind the venue had disappeared completely into the darkness of the early morning hours. I placed my purse gently on the kitchen table and removed my coat before turning on the small lamp near the window. The soft light filled the room in a warm circle that felt peaceful compared to the bright celebration I had left behind. For a moment I simply stood there listening to the silence of the house. It had been several years since Richard passed away, yet his presence still seemed to linger in the quiet spaces of the rooms we had shared for so long. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it always had, the wooden table polished smooth from decades of family dinners and late-night conversations. I walked slowly to the chair where Richard used to sit and rested my hand on the back of it for a moment before sitting down. Then I opened my purse and placed the small white card on the table in front of me. The gold letters reflected the soft light from the lamp. The ATM of the family. I studied those words again, not with anger but with the same calm clarity that had settled into my mind earlier that evening. Sometimes a single sentence reveals years of misunderstanding all at once. I reached for the phone sitting on the counter and checked the time. It was a little after 11 in the evening. Too late to call anyone tonight, but early enough to make plans for tomorrow. I left the card where it was and prepared a small cup of tea before walking into the living room and sitting by the window. Outside the neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I spent several minutes thinking about the conversation Daniel and I had shared earlier in the evening. His request for help with the extended honeymoon had sounded so casual, so certain, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For years I had answered those requests without hesitation because I believed I was supporting my family in a meaningful way. But the words printed on that small card had changed the context of everything. They had revealed how my generosity had been interpreted all along. The next morning's sunlight filled the kitchen long before I finished my first cup of coffee. I woke early, the way I usually do, and the quiet clarity from the night before had not faded. If anything, it felt even steadier in the calm light of day. I placed the card on the kitchen table again beside my phone and looked at it one last time before picking up the receiver. Martin Hayes answered after the second ring, his voice warm but professional as always. "Margaret, it has been a while," he said. "How have you been?" I smiled faintly even though he could not see it. "I attended my son's wedding last night," I replied calmly. "And it reminded me that we should review the trust documents Richard created." Martin paused for a moment before responding. "Of course," he said. "Is there something specific you would like to discuss?" I looked down at the card resting on the table while I answered. "Yes," I said gently. "I believe it is time to adjust how certain assets are managed moving forward." Martin did not ask unnecessary questions. That was one of the reasons Richard trusted him so much. Instead he simply said, "I understand. We can schedule a meeting this afternoon if you are available." I agreed and wrote down the time before ending the call. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I walked through the house, tidying small things the way I always did on calm days like this. By early afternoon I drove to Martin's office downtown, a familiar building I had visited several times over the years whenever Richard wanted to review financial documents. Martin greeted me in the lobby and led me into his office where the trust files were already waiting on the desk. We spent the next hour reviewing every detail carefully. The accounts, the investments, the property attached to the trust, and the authority I held as trustee. At the end of the meeting Martin looked at me thoughtfully and said, "You have the legal right to make these changes if you believe it is appropriate." I nodded calmly. "I do." When the paperwork was complete I left the office and stepped back into the quiet afternoon sunlight. The streets were busy with people moving between offices and shops, unaware that anything important had just happened. In a way that felt fitting. Some of the most significant decisions in life happen without witnesses or applause. That evening my phone rang just after dinner. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered calmly and listened while he spoke with the same cheerful tone he had used the night before. "Mom, Olivia and I found the perfect villa for the honeymoon," he said excitedly. "It overlooks the Mediterranean and everything. We were hoping you could help us finalize the reservation tomorrow." I let a brief silence pass before replying. "Daniel," I said gently, "there is something I need to explain." He paused on the other end of the line, clearly surprised by the change in my voice. "What do you mean?" he asked. I glanced toward the kitchen table where the card still rested beside the lamp. The gold letters were slightly dimmer now in the evening light, but the message remained exactly the same. "It simply means," I said calmly, "that the arrangement you have relied on for many years is no longer in operation." Daniel sounded confused. "I do not understand." I smiled softly as I spoke the final words of the conversation. "The machine you mentioned at the wedding dinner," I said gently, "has been turned off.